If you looked at even at very fine detail at books of Apple, you could not find an item that says Steve Jobs worth $100 billion. Okay, why? Because the accountants are a conservative bunch. If they don't have a consistent way of valuing something, they attach a value of zero to that. Who knows what's the value of Steve Jobs is? You know how we found out the value market attached to Steve Jobs? When Apple announced that Steve Jobs had terminal pancreatic cancer, which typically those days had a 95% survival rate, and these days it's probably 90%. It's one of the most aggressive cancers. Uh, Apple tanked about 10% that day as soon as the announcement was made. I don't remember what market value of Apple was those days. Let's say it was about $1 trillion. That means market was attaching $100 billion value to Steve Jobs alone. But you'll never see that in the book value. Is anybody going to argue that Steve Jobs is not a significant asset to Apple? He was. In fact, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy before they rehired him. Do you guys know his story with Apple? He's one of the founders of the Apple. There were three of them: him, DeVos, Steve Wozniak, and there was another guy. I don't remember his name now. But Steve Jobs was kind of the creative guy. But Apple could not compete that well with PCs because Apple computers were more expensive, even though they were much better, both in terms of hardware quality and user interface. Like they are the first ones that actually used mice in personal computers. Until 1987, there were no mice on PCs. You basically wrote line commands that was called DOS, but Apple already had mouse as early as 1982, I think, in a computer they named Lisa. Those Lisas had a hard drive of or a memory of 1 megabyte. And in one of the biggest blunders of his career ever, Apple said it's 1 megabyte, but optionally we can give you a computer that has 2 megabytes of RAM. And Bill Gates said, who the hell needs a computer with 2 megabytes of RAM? Now you can't even run simple stuff with 2 megabytes of RAM. So Apple couldn't compete because PCs or the Apple Macintosh computers were the only thing. And by mid 90s, Apple fired Steve Jobs. I mean, he was still one of the largest shareholders, but they fired him from the job of CEO. And by the end of 90s, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy, and they begged Steve Jobs to come back. He came back. Within a year, they came up with the first iPod. And what's that music thingy? Huh? No, this store. Huh? iTunes. And then it was followed by iPod Nano, iPhone, iPad, and you know the rest of the story. So Steve Jobs was such an asset. I mean, he was the design guy. He didn't do any of the technical stuff, but he basically told people what he wanted. And what he wanted was exactly what consumers wanted, even though they didn't know they wanted. Sometimes you design products where your customers don't even know they want it, but once you show it to them, it's like, oh, this is exactly what I need. That was why I was so successful when I sold customized derivatives back in my mid to late 30s, because I designed products thinking what my clients would want, even though they didn't even know what they wanted. And when you start design with the customer in mind, surprise, surprise, you're actually successful. I apply similar stuff to my, stuff that I do in my classes. You guys probably didn't think that you needed something like Jeopardy, but the more we played, the more I see that you guys actually love it. You don't have to tell me. Even if you do, I'm going to ignore it because I hate suck ups. But I see the enthusiasm that you guys are bringing to the game because, there's engagements. When you design these things with prices, people are surprised. When you attach prices to behavior, people, even students, respond to those prices. If there was no price to not participating in the Jeopardy, you wouldn't have participated. That is human nature. More importantly, that is student nature. Because for whatever reason you guys want to do path of least resistance. That's not going to work when you start working somewhere, but that's your student mode. That's another reason I put in these things so that you can get out of those. So those book values are seriously underrepresented. Sometimes book values actually seriously overvalued. Think of Japan in mid 90s. Hello. Think of Japan in mid 90s. If you don't know anything about the history of Japan, Japan is a nation of small islands, okay? And most of the islands are mountains and stuff. So the actual arable land and places where people live is even a much smaller percentage of already small part of Japan. I mean, the metropolitan Tokyo is home to over 30 million people. I mean, if you thought New York City was crowded, try going to Tokyo or Osaka. Okay, even smaller cities, like I don't know, up in Hokkaido, Sapporo, for example, or Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Those are very crowded cities. That means real estate is rather valuable. And Japanese companies, because of their advantages over US companies, made a lot of money in 70s and 80s. And they invested a lot of money into real estate. In fact, the whole thing created a real estate bubble. I mean, it would have been impossible for a upper middle class person to buy their own apartment, not even a house, an apartment in Tokyo. It was prohibitively expensive. And just like any bubble, that bubble burst in late 90s, in late 80s. In 1989, the value of the Japanese stock index, Nikkei 225, was around 40,000. That was its peak then. And this is in yen terms. And those days, $1 bought you about 80 yen. Now $1 buys you about 150-ish or so. Nikkei went down all the way to 8,000, while yen was going down to 150, or dollar yen going up to 150, which means uh, in dollar terms, Nikkei lost about 90% of its value. We're not talking about a small cap stock. We're talking about the 225 largest stocks in Japan. But if you look at the books of those firms, those real estate holdings are booked at their acquisition cost minus any accumulated depreciation. So it's high. So those book values are going to be too high or too low. One nice thing about residual income model, at least theoretically speaking, it is self-correcting. And let's see how self-correcting it is. Let's do this. Suppose actual book value, whatever that means, is B0 star. Okay? But I will use B0, which is B0 star plus some delta. Delta is universal symbol for difference of change, right? So if I do this, um, the actual B0 star T or B0 star is B0 minus delta. Okay. So I started with, let's say, undervaluing the book value. That means it's going to continue. All right. So let's do residual income model using the actual B stars. Okay. I'm going to call that B star. So we're going to reopen this. This is equal to BT minus delta. Okay. Plus sum I equals 1 to infinity ET minus rho times BT plus rho times delta. So this is BT plus, I'm going to take this part,